Have you ever felt like you were observing yourself from a distance, as if your own body didn't quite belong to you? This strange sensation of detachment from herself is exactly what enveloped Metlin Whitmore the day Oliver appeared in her office. In that moment, she ceased to feel like Metlin Whitmore, the seasoned psychotherapist with 30 years of experience, the respected professional. She transformed into someone else, someone who, against her will, felt the ground slip out from under her feet at the first encounter with the stranger. Oliver was young, not yet 30. His appearance in Metlin's office on a typical workday was unexpected. Typically, her patients were couples in relationship crises, elderly individuals dealing with loss, or young women struggling with family life. Oliver stood out among them. He seemed like an outsider, as if a unique aura surrounded him. The air in the office seemed to shift with his arrival. There was no hint of the usual signs common among her patients: hidden anxiety, a bewildered gaze, nervous hand gestures. On the contrary, every one of his movements was deliberate and precise. By all accounts, she should have started with the usual questions therapists use to put patients at ease, but something in his gaze unsettled Metlin. She found herself uttering a phrase that had never crossed her lips before. "You don't seem like someone who needs therapy." A faint smile touched the corners of his lips, as if he had expected to hear exactly that. His voice was low, yet there was a softness in his delivery, as if each syllable was carefully weighed to evoke a specific reaction. He leaned forward slightly, and Metlin, without realizing it, mirrored his movement. "I suppose I don't know myself as well as I'd like to," he said. These words disarmed Metlin. More often than not, people came to her with fragmented personalities, hoping she could help them piece themselves back together. But Oliver didn't seem lost. He was more like someone who already knew how to sew, but had come merely to confirm she didn't have the right thread. Metlin held her pen above the notepad on her lap, but she wrote nothing. It was strange. She always took notes, even casually, but this time she couldn't bring herself to. "So," she asked, crossing her legs and feeling the fabric of her skirt glide against her skin, as if every movement had become more distinct. "What exactly do you hope to gain here?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on her, and replied, "I want to understand why I act the way I do and not otherwise, why I have such an impact on people." It was an intriguing statement. Usually, in such cases, Metlin would dig deeper, asking direct questions to elicit the necessary information, but this time something stirred within her, and she smiled. She felt a little wider than she should have. "What kind of impact do you have on people, Oliver?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her with his eyes, as if contemplating which version of the truth to present to her. His gaze glided over her face, lingering on her lips a moment longer than it should have, before returning to her eyes. "I think you already know," he said. There was a challenge in his voice. Metlin's stomach tightened, but it wasn't the kind of flutter usually associated with the beginning of a romance. It was something deeper, almost frightening, as if she had encountered something she shouldn't have touched. Her professional instinct told her to change the subject, but instead she leaned forward slightly. "What makes you think you have such a strong impact on people?" He shrugged, a casual gesture, yet his eyes remained as attentive as ever. "I don't know for sure. Perhaps I just see right through them. Sometimes I feel like I see things in them that they don't even notice themselves." This answer struck a chord with Metlin, not because it was unusual, but because for a moment, it felt as though he was speaking of something she wouldn't want anyone to see in herself. When Oliver left the office, Metlin stood motionless for several minutes, staring at the empty spot where he had just been sitting. What had just happened? In her practice, she had dealt with all sorts of patients, difficult ones, manipulative ones, and outright liars. But Oliver was different. He was something else entirely. He had touched something within her that she hadn't even known existed. She suddenly realized that for the first time in 30 years of practice, she hadn't taken a single note during the session. Nothing like this had ever happened to her before. On her way home, she drove her usual route, past the same cafes and shops she had seen for decades. Everything was as usual, but she felt different. Something had shifted inside her, something she couldn't quite name. Richard, at home, was laughing at some silly video of cats or a man building a house out of clay, and he only glanced at her for a second before returning his gaze to the screen. No questions about how her day was, or if she was all right. Just the familiar silence. As she went upstairs, Metlin felt a pang of anger, but it wasn't directed at her husband, but at herself. She had chosen this life. She had made a promise, but in that moment, she felt trapped in an existence that no longer felt like her own. In her mind, she closed her eyes, trying to forget the day, but Oliver's face appeared before her mind's eye, his eyes which seemed to see right through her. His calm, confident way of speaking. And then she understood he was Richard's complete opposite. Metlin was the embodiment of everything Richard lacked. In that very moment, standing under the scalding streams of water, a question full of desperation escaped her lips. "What is wrong with me?" She, an experienced therapist of many years, a married woman, suddenly found herself captive to her emotions. Was this merely transference? A fleeting emotional reaction with no real basis? She wanted to believe it was. However, Oliver's missed session was merely the starting point in a whirlwind of events for which Metlin was completely unprepared. What was she to do when her own desires began to challenge her moral principles and everything she held sacred? The clock mercilessly ticked away the minutes, 3:15, and Oliver still hadn't appeared. The nervous tapping of her pen against the notepad tried to fill the uncomfortable void that had formed in the office. But why did it bother her so much? She should only have felt professional disappointment, nothing more. But deep down, something more lingered, a heavy sense of annoyance and an inexplicable disquiet. Where did it come from? There was no answer. She tried to convince herself it was merely a matter of professional duty after all. She had invested considerable effort in building an impeccable reputation, and it was her responsibility to ensure patients didn't discontinue treatment. Yet deep down, she knew it wasn't about that at all. It was about him, about how he made her feel alive, as if his presence had awakened something within her that had lain dormant for years. Then the phone rang, and seeing his name on the screen, her heart treacherously quickened. Oliver's slightly breathless voice came through the receiver. She should have maintained professionalism, rescheduled the appointment for next week, established the boundaries she had always so strictly upheld. But instead, before reason could prevail over emotion, the words escaped her. "Can you come over tonight? We could talk at my place." Silence hung in the air in response, and she felt a flush creep up her face. What had she done? This went against every rule she had followed for the past 30 years. "To your place?" he repeated, a clear curiosity in his voice. "Yes," she replied, a little too quickly, trying to inject casualness into her voice. "It's after hours now, but if you're truly committed to working, I don't see an issue." After hanging up, she stared at the phone as if it were about to explode. Richard, as always, was engrossed in his phone on the sofa. He barely registered her entering the room, let alone the change in her voice. No questions, no curiosity, just an indifferent murmur. "Could you get me a glass of water?" What a stark contrast, Oliver, shrouded in mystery, teasing every nerve in her body, making her question everything she thought she knew about herself. And Richard, the man she had lived with for 42 years, now as predictable as the roof over her head. Around 7 o'clock that evening, she looked in the mirror. A reflection with curious, almost defiant eyes stared back at her. What was she trying to do? Invite Oliver to her home? Was it about him or something she herself needed to feel again? She put on lipstick, something she hadn't done in a very long time, and was pleasantly surprised by how soft the shade looked on her lips. When the doorbell rang, her heart nearly stopped. With hands damp from nerves, she opened the door. In the dim evening light, he stood there. A leather coat, emphasizing his physique, gave him an appearance both familiar and mysterious. He was young, yet possessed the confidence of someone who already knew how to influence the world around him. "Good evening, doctor," he said, and the way the words left his lips felt more intimate than they should have. Richard, as usual, was absorbed in his phone, his gaze fixed on the screen. As they passed the living room, he cast a fleeting glance at them, mumbled an indifferent, "Hi," and re-immersed himself in the virtual world. No questions, no curious glance, nothing. She led Oliver into the library, the only place in the house where remnants of her former self seemed to linger, books lined in neat rows on tall shelves, and the lingering scent of old wood in the air. As she closed the door, her fingers paused for a moment before turning the key in the lock. The click echoed in the silence, and she wondered if he had noticed. "Are you expecting someone to interrupt us?" he asked, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "No," she lied, walking towards the sofa. "Just a habit." Oliver sat casually, yet the way he settled into the armchair exuded a confidence that seemed to fill the entire space. She sat opposite him, crossing her legs. Her dress softly glided against her skin, and for the first time in a long while, she felt her body. "Are you always so welcoming with your patients?" he asked, with something more than mere curiosity in his voice. "No," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "But it seems you need help more than you let on." The tension between them thickened. "Am I that obvious?" "Not at all," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "But people don't just come to a therapist for no reason." The look he gave her in return was almost disarming. He hesitated for a moment, nervously picking at the seam of his jeans. "Maybe I'm trying to understand why people don't see me for who I really am. Or maybe I'm just testing you." Suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, came the confession, "Perhaps I'm just testing you." Taken aback by such directness, she could only stammer, "Testing me?" "Yes," he said, leaning forward. "I'm curious if you see something in me that escapes others' notice." Her heart pounded wildly, but outwardly she maintained her composure. "And what exactly do you think I see?" A pause followed, as if he was meticulously studying every feature of her face, memorizing the slightest contours. "I think you see something special in me because you recognize it in yourself." His words struck her like a lightning bolt, not because they were true, but because of a subconscious fear that there was a grain of truth in them. That evening, after seeing Oliver out, she sat in the library for a long time, staring at the closed door. She didn't want to go to the bedroom, to see a drowsy Richard engrossed in his mobile phone. In the silence of the house, she tried to sort through the storm of emotions his visit had stirred. Oliver had become a kind of mirror, and for the first time in a long while, she saw not her own reflection in him, but something that made her question her very self. What else would Oliver reveal at their next meeting? Or perhaps she herself would discover something within her that she hadn't even suspected. The boundaries of what was permissible were blurring, and the line between desire and reason grew increasingly fine. The clock hands pointed to 7,005 when the doorbell rang. Her heart pounded wildly, her hands trembled as she adjusted the hem of her dress once more, already flawless. There he stood at the doorstep, Oliver, with that same enigmatic smile, hinting at both mystery and defiance. His leather coat accentuated his flawless physique, as if he sought to fill all the space around him. "Good evening, doctor." His low, enveloping voice resonated, and something stirred within her. "Good evening," she murmured, stepping aside as if inviting him not just into her home, but into her life. Richard, as usual, was in his virtual reality, the sounds of his mobile phone echoing through the house, a reminder of the oppressive routine. As they passed, she tried to casually explain, "He missed his appointment today. He just needed to talk." Richard merely shrugged, without looking up from the screen, as if the presence of a stranger in his home was as mundane as the TV show he was watching. His indifference struck her. He didn't care. He hadn't even asked. Perhaps this was the final argument for change. Once alone with Oliver in the library, she locked the door, as if trying to shield herself from the outside world. The click of the bolt echoed through the room, and for a moment she questioned the rightness of her action. But turning back, she met Oliver's gaze, full of unsolved mysteries. "Are you afraid we'll be interrupted?" he asked with irony. "No," she lied, though both understood the real reason for her decision. Oliver leisurely walked around the room, as if assessing the surroundings. His gaze swept over the bookshelves, the paintings on the walls, and finally rested on her. "You have interesting taste," he casually remarked. "And you have a habit of studying people instead of talking to them," she retorted, crossing her arms over her chest in a futile attempt to regain control of the situation. He smiled, and his smile conveyed an awareness of his actions. "I only study those who intrigue me," he said, leaning slightly against the table. His words hung in the air, laden with an unspoken meaning that both of them tried to ignore. She sat down in the leather armchair, crossing one leg over the other. The hem of her dress rode up, exposing her knees, and she noticed his gaze linger on them for a moment. "So, Oliver," she began, trying to steer the conversation back to therapy, "what exactly are you looking for?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Perhaps I'm trying to understand why I feel so detached from reality, or why I have such an impact on people that I can't control. And how do you think that affects people?" Oliver looked at her in a way that took her breath away. "I don't know, doctor. I think you could tell me." This veiled game was growing increasingly dangerous. The tension in the air was palpable, though it shouldn't have been. Then he asked a simple, disarming question. "Are you happy?" His words struck her to the core, as if he had voiced her own thoughts, ones she was afraid to admit even to herself. She fell silent, feeling the weight of every second of quiet. She hesitated, feeling every second of silence press on her shoulders with an immense weight. "Happiness, it's a relative concept," she uttered, carefully weighing each word. "That's not what I asked," he countered, closing the distance and settling on the edge of the sofa. His proximity felt almost physical. The room seemed to shrink to the size of a matchbox, and only the muffled sounds of a TV from the next room reminded them of the outside world. "Am I happy?" she whispered, barely audible, realizing she didn't know the answer. How long had it been since she last asked herself that question? How much time had passed since she stopped wondering if she was truly living or just existing? Before she could formulate an answer, his hand lightly touched her, an innocent, almost accidental gesture that nevertheless had the effect of a bombshell. "You deserve this," he said, and his gaze was impossible to look away from. Then he leaned in, his breath scorching her skin. She should have stopped him, said something, but the words seemed to evaporate, giving way to a suddenly awakened feeling. Forgetting logic and morals, she surrendered to the power of the moment, tense, burning, irresistible. The kiss was not just a physical act, but a point of no return, a break with her former beliefs and ideas of what was right. Yet as he pulled her closer, the only thought pulsing in her mind was, why did it take me so long to feel alive again? The ensuing silence was deafening. Oliver left with an unperturbed look, adjusting his shirt while she struggled to regain some semblance of composure. "This shouldn't have happened," she whispered, as if justifying herself. He merely shrugged, and a faint smile played on his lips. "Sometimes the best things happen when they're not supposed to." With those words, he left the room, leaving her alone with the quiet click of the closing door and the echo of her own doubts. Returning to the living room, she found Richard still engrossed in his mobile phone, as if nothing had happened. For Metlin, it was a moment of truth, when her future actions would determine not only the fate of her marriage, but also her own perception of herself as a woman. How far was she willing to go? And what would happen when her desires clashed with the inevitable consequences? The sound of the closing door echoed through the quiet library like a verdict delivered. Oliver was gone, but his presence seemed to permeate the air, the woody scent of his cologne, the warmth he left behind from being close, even his gaze, as if he saw parts of her that she had forgotten existed. She stood motionless for several minutes, trying to organize the thoughts swirling in her head. But there was no system in this chaos. What had happened was far more than just a fleeting mistake. It was a moment that made her question everything. Leaving the library, she went to the living room, where Richard was still lying on the sofa, engrossed in his phone. He didn't even glance at her, as if she were invisible, a ghost wandering through the house. The contrast between his indifferent silence and Oliver's burning energy was almost unbearable. Richard no longer saw her, and she didn't know if he ever would again. Has everyone, at least once in their life, experienced a feeling of detachment, as if life passes by while you remain merely an outside observer? This is exactly what she felt every time she looked at Richard. He represented stability, but at the same time, the burden of a life that was slowly but surely fading. But where was the limit? How far could one go in justifying their actions when feeling lonely, abandoned, and forgotten? As she climbed the stairs to her room, she kept asking herself, whose fault is this, mine or both of ours? Was it revenge or just an attempt to distract herself from the real problem she didn't want to face? Once in the bedroom, she sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling a slight tremor in her hands. Her thoughts returned to the beginning of their journey together, 42 years ago, when she and Richard exchanged their vows. They were young, full of hope and plans, in love with life and unaware of what awaited them. But time relentlessly erases feelings. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She took out an old photo album, hidden deep in the closet. She slowly turned the pages, looking at photographs that captured moments, it seemed, from another life. Richard, smiling broadly, embracing her, laughing and happy in her wedding dress. It was hard to believe that these people were them. When did the turning point occur? Perhaps when he retired and sank into a routine? Or did it happen earlier, when days became predictable and conversations lost their edge? Perhaps she would never know the exact answer, but the result was evident. A marriage that existed only on paper, while love, passion, and mutual understanding were irrevocably lost. Her thoughts returned to Oliver. He was dangerous not only for who he was, but for what he symbolized: possibility. He awakened something in her that she had believed long dead. It wasn't just desire, but a need to be seen, to be wanted, for something new and vibrant to burst into her life after long years of monotony. That night, she couldn't sleep for a long time. Images of Oliver and Richard alternately appeared in her head, like two sides of the same coin. One trapped her in the past, while the other pushed her towards something she knew was wrong, but at the same time seemed irresistibly appealing. The inescapability of the situation weighed heavily on her. The next day dragged on agonizingly slowly. Getting out of bed, Metline performed her usual morning rituals and went to the office. Each visitor seemed to bring with them a whirlwind of reflections on her own life. A middle-aged woman shared her pangs of guilt over a sudden passion for another man while being bound by marriage. A young man spoke frankly about his fear of serious relationships and his inability to build long-term connections. Listening to their stories, Metline felt a deep desire to admit she understood their feelings intimately, but professional duty prevented her from doing so. She had to remain an impartial therapist, a voice of reason, not a person desperately in need of help. Metline realized she was balancing on the edge of an emotional abyss. Days turned into nights, and Oliver's image haunted her like a persistent shadow, defining all her thoughts and feelings. She wondered if he felt something similar. Were their encounters as thrilling for him as they were for her? Unfortunately, there were no simple answers to these questions. Scientific research shows that attraction in long-term marriages significantly weakens after 10 to 15 years of married life. This is a common phenomenon driven by biological processes. Dopamine, the hormone responsible for initial passion, is gradually replaced by oxytocin, the bonding hormone. But what happens when this bond is no longer enough? When desire and passion fade? That evening, Metline returned home to find Richard, as usual, engrossed in watching television. He glanced at her briefly and, without thinking, said, Dinner's in the oven. I made your favorite dish." At that moment, a pang of guilt struck her. Richard wasn't a bad person. He was kind and considerate, but the oppressive feeling of his emotional detachment had become unbearable, and she didn't know how to fix it. Metline sat beside him on the sofa, but even being so close, she felt an immense chasm between them. She took the remote, turned off the television, and looked at her husband. "Richard, do you think we're okay?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Of course, everything's fine. What's wrong?" Metline wanted to tell him everything that had been building up inside her. She longed to tell him about her loneliness, about how he no longer saw her, but the words caught in her throat. "Nothing," she replied, forcing a smile. Once in the bedroom, Metline again sank onto the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled slightly. She felt like a hostage in a vicious cycle of silence that seemed unbreakable, but for the first time, she doubted if she wanted to continue this meaningless dance. She picked up her phone and opened Oliver's contact. The mere fact that she thought about it alarmed her, as it went against all her principles. She knew she was playing with fire, but a part of her craved that flame, even knowing it could burn her. As Metline approached a turning point in her life, the decision she would make could forever change her destiny. But how would she cope with the consequences when desire and guilt became unbearable? And how far was Oliver willing to go? When Metline returned to the library, the house was silent and cold. Richard was already asleep, and his predictable routine once again reminded her of everything that kept her in this marriage. The air seemed to thicken, filled with a tension that, as she understood, existed only in her imagination. But at that moment, it didn't matter what was real and what wasn't. All that mattered was what was about to happen. The phone was in her hand, Oliver's contact glowing on the screen. Her finger hovered over the call button, and for a moment she heard only the pounding of her own heart, heavy, anxious, like a clock counting down the time allotted for her decision. She was torn between duty and what her body, mind, and perhaps even her soul craved. Finally, she pressed the call button, and the wait for an answer felt like an eternity. Oliver answered after the third ring. His voice was calm, but with a hint of curiosity that sent a shiver down Metline's spine. "Doc?" he said, as if anticipating her call. "Didn't expect to hear from you this late." "I need to talk to you," she replied, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "Can we meet?" A pause followed, and Metline imagined a smile spreading across his face. "Of course. When and where?" "Now," she mumbled, realizing that any hesitation might make her back down. "In the library." He didn't ask questions. He simply agreed, and Metline hung up, feeling a mix of relief and fear. What had she done? Why had she crossed a line she promised never to cross? But the answer was clear. She was searching for what had disappeared from her life years ago, the feeling of being alive, desired, loved. When the doorbell rang, Metline confidently walked to the door, though her heart was pounding. Oliver stood on the threshold, as calm and confident as ever, as if he understood what was happening in her soul, even if she couldn't explain it. "You came," she whispered, barely audible. "I promised," he replied, entering the house and closing the door behind him. He followed her into the library, and the sound of his footsteps echoed softly down the hallway. When they closed the door, the ensuing silence became almost deafening. "You seem agitated," he observed, leaning casually against the table. "This isn't like you, is it?" "Indeed," Metline agreed, crossing her arms over her chest as if building a barrier. "I don't usually do this." Then what changed? The question hung in the air, and she didn't immediately find an answer. She could have lamented the monotony of married life, the years when she felt unseen, almost forgetting her own identity, but all of that seemed only part of the truth. The real reason was both simpler and more complex. "Because with you, I feel what I thought I had lost," she confessed. Without waiting for further words, he approached, looking directly into her eyes, and the distance between them seemed to dissolve. "You deserve these feelings," he said in a hushed, tense voice, and then he kissed her. This time, there was no hesitation, no immediate feeling of guilt. It was like falling into a turbulent stream, unstoppable and uncontrolled. She dissolved into the moment, into his embrace, into his touch, as if all her dormant feelings had finally awakened. However, when it was over, the weight of the consequences began to press on her shoulders. As Oliver, maintaining his composure, buttoned his shirt, Metline sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to process what had happened. "Are you all right, Doc?" he asked, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite place. "I'm not sure, honestly," she replied. "I don't understand what any of this means." "It means you finally chose yourself," he said, and those words resonated deeply within her. Returning to the bedroom, Metline saw that Richard was still asleep, his face relaxed in slumber, as if he was far from questions about how something so familiar could suddenly seem so foreign. She didn't know how to deal with this new sensation. She didn't understand if her feelings for Oliver were genuine, or if it was merely an attempt to escape a reality that no longer satisfied her. In the following days, the situation only grew more complicated. Oliver continued to attend her sessions, becoming increasingly confident and alluring. Metline, however, found herself in limbo, torn between a thirst for change and the agonizing guilt of what she was risking. And then, Richard finally understood everything. It wasn't a loud revelation or a dramatic scene. It happened in the most mundane moment during dinner, when he put down his fork and looked at her in a way he hadn't in years. "You've changed," he said, and his eyes reflected a pain Metline wasn't prepared for. "What's happening with you, Metline?" The words caught in her throat. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? "I just feel like something's missing," she confessed, and tears welled up in her eyes. Life presented her with a choice, to stay or to leave, to confront or to hide. But Metline still didn't know which path to choose. Life consists of a series of moments, decisions, and their consequences, and sometimes the hardest choice is the one that forces us to acknowledge who we truly are.